Have you ever felt a hollow so deep it eats away at you from the inside? I'm not talking about hunger, the kind that food or drink can satisfy. This is a wound that doesn't close. An emptiness that gnaws at you no matter where you are. You could stand in the warmth of a fire or feel the press of a crowd, but the void remains, unyielding. I've wondered for years if I was born wrong, as if something vital was missing from the start. Then one day I heard whispers of a man. They said he was a voice of comfort, a stranger who made people feel seen. He walked from village to village, speaking to fishermen and farmers, people like me, with dust on their feet and burdens no one else saw. They said his presence was like a balm, his silence often more soothing than words. At first, I dismissed it. I didn't need another wandering philosopher, another preacher offering easy answers. Words couldn't reach the hollow inside me. But the stories lingered, settling into me like the dust from the roads he traveled. People didn't speak of him as they would a king or a warrior, but with a reverence that made me wonder. They spoke of his kindness, his gentle voice, the way he remembered the names of even the most forgotten, and something in those stories stirred me. I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could offer something I couldn't name, an answer to a yearning I barely understood. There was more than my own emptiness to consider. The whispers carried rumors that this man might be the one, the Messiah we had waited for, the deliverer who would break the chains of Rome. For centuries, our people had prayed for someone to liberate us, to restore dignity to those crushed under the weight of an empire. Was he the one who would rise up and lead us to freedom? That hope, mingled with my own longing, became too much to ignore. So I went looking for him. The first time I saw him, he was standing on a hillside, surrounded by a crowd. Something pulled at me, compelling me to step closer. He looked so ordinary, his clothes faded to the color of desert stone, frayed at the edges from too many miles. But there was something in his stillness, the way his gaze met the eyes of those around him, that made the air feel heavier. He stood quietly, his presence like a weight you couldn't explain. I hesitated, watching him from a distance, unsure if I dared to get closer. He began to speak, and the crowd leaned in as if drawn by something invisible. His voice was calm, steady, like a river flowing over stone. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he said, each word unhurried, as though he wanted them to settle in the air. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." There was something strange in his words. He spoke as if he understood the ache inside each person, as if he saw the wounds hidden too deep to show. I watched the faces around me soften, some with tears in their eyes, and I felt it too. A loosening, a slight unclenching in my chest that I hadn't expected. For the first time, I wondered if his words might reach the emptiness inside me. I kept following him after that, drawn by something I couldn't explain. He moved from village to village, quiet and unassuming, yet wherever he went, people gathered. He spoke of kindness, forgiveness, burdens shared and eased. I noticed how he sought out the weary, the ones who hung back, and how their faces softened in his presence, as though they'd been truly seen for the first time. But my hope wasn't only for my own hollow soul. I began to think about the whispers, the rumors, and wonder if this man could truly be the one we'd prayed for. I hoped he might ignite something, a spark to rally the people, to rise against the Romans who had crushed us for so long. A Messiah was meant to be a liberator, and as I followed him, I couldn't help but wonder if he was the one to fulfill that promise. And yet, as I watched, questions began to stir. He was gentle, yes, kind even, but kindness doesn't drive out enemies or bring justice. Each time he spoke of forgiving those who wronged us, of showing compassion to strangers, something in me twisted. How could kindness alone stand against men who stripped us of dignity every day? So tell me, what would you have thought? Would you have stayed, hoping that this kindness was part of something larger? Or would you have turned away, disappointed in the quietness of it all? One night, after he had spoken to a crowd by the shore, I lingered as the others drifted away. He sat alone by the water, his gaze fixed on the waves, his silhouette barely visible against the starlit sky. There was a stillness to him, a calm that felt almost heavy, as if he carried something I couldn't see. I took a step forward, the ache in my chest tightening, a question burning at the back of my throat. I wanted to ask him, needed to ask him why he was here, what he intended to do with this quiet compassion he wore like a cloak. "Are you here to save us?" I wanted to say, but the words tangled in my throat. How could I demand that he fill the void in me? A void I barely understood myself. He looked up, his gaze finding mine, and for a moment it felt as though he could see every question, every doubt, every hidden corner of my heart. But he didn't speak. He just looked, his eyes soft, sad, as if he understood the pain of waiting for something you couldn't name, the weight of carrying a hope you were afraid to release. I left that night with the question still churning inside me, twisting tighter, sharper, like a splinter pressing into a wound. I wanted to believe he was more than just a man, that he held an answer, a purpose, something big enough to fill the ache that gnawed at me. But each time I looked to him for certainty, he gave only compassion, only kindness, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had pinned my hopes on a man who didn't have the strength to give me what I needed. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Still I stayed. I told myself it was hope that kept me near, but maybe it was stubbornness, or fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear that if I left, I'd carry the emptiness inside me forever, with no spark left to chase. Each time he reached out to the broken, each time he spoke of forgiving those who oppressed us, something in me twisted tighter. Have I pinned my hopes on a man who could never be what I needed him to be? Still, I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until I knew for sure. And deep down I knew that something was coming. Something that would either fill that hollow place inside me or break me beyond repair. Each day I followed him through dust-choked streets and sun-scorched villages, feeling the ache in my chest grow heavier with every step. This man, a healer, a friend to the broken, was supposed to be the answer to everything gnawing at me, to all the silence, suffering, and injustice we endured under Rome. But the more I watched, the more questions clawed their way into my mind. He wasn't doing what I'd expected. He didn't rally people, didn't call for justice or strength. Instead, he touched the sick, fed the hungry, forgave debts, as if his only purpose was to ease burdens rather than to lift us out of oppression. Where was the fire I had hoped for, the strength to drive out our captors? One afternoon, we were gathered in a crowded square. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fresh bread, dust hanging in the sunlight as he spoke to the people, farmers, mothers, children clutching at their parents' robes. "Turn the other cheek," he said. "Love your enemies." A spark of anger lit in my chest, sharp and fierce. I wanted to believe his words, I truly did, but as I watched the faces in the crowd, I couldn't help but wonder, what good was forgiveness against hunger? What use was compassion against the weight of Rome's heel? How could he say that? How could he look into the faces of people who had been beaten, robbed, who had lost loved ones, and ask them to show love to their oppressors? I clenched my fists, feeling a low burn rise in my gut. I wanted to shout, to ask him if he understood what it felt like to live under the constant threat of Rome, to see friends and family lose everything. But the crowd was silent, hanging on to his every word, and my voice felt trapped, choked by the bitterness that had become a part of me. All I could do was stare, frustration boiling inside me, the hollow ache turning into something jagged, something I could barely contain. I started to see the cracks then. Little by little, my faith in him was coming undone. He was a healer, yes, a man of peace, a guide for the weary. But was that enough? Then came the tax collector, a man who had betrayed his own, who had lined his pockets with the wages of our suffering. As he slinked forward, eyes downcast, I felt the crowd stiffen, a low murmur of disgust passing through the people. I couldn't stop myself. I stepped forward, pointing at the man. "You take from your own," I said sharply, "and you expect forgiveness?" The crowd's whispers grew louder, nods of agreement rippling through them. For a moment I thought I'd seen a spark in their anger, a fire waiting to be stoked. But the healer stepped forward. He didn't speak to me. He laid a hand on the tax collector's shoulder and looked him in the eye. "You are forgiven," he said softly, and the man crumbled to his knees. My own anger burned hotter. Forgiven? How could he forgive someone who had caused so much suffering? How could he forgive the very people who had betrayed us, who had sold us out to the Romans. Where was the justice? Where was the strength to set things right? Would you have stayed, hoping there was some hidden purpose beneath all this gentleness? Or would you have turned away, feeling the slow, crushing weight of disappointment? I stayed. I stayed because I couldn't bring myself to leave, and there was a part of me, small but stubborn, that whispered that maybe this was leading somewhere. Maybe he would gather these people, the sick and the broken, and bring them together in a movement no one could stop. But each time I watched him touch a Roman soldier, each time he forgave a man who had wronged his own people, my hope thinned, stretched over a frustration I couldn't silence. One evening, he was speaking to a small gathering on the edge of a village. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. I could smell smoke from the fires, hear the crackling of dry branches, the soft murmur of voices. I kept my distance, my hands clenched into fists, watching as he spoke words of peace. "Blessed are the peacemakers," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. Peacemakers. My hands clenched tighter, my nails pressing into my palms. How could peace mean anything when we were held under a boot, when we'd been stripped of our dignity, our land, our families? That night I lay on the hard ground beneath a sky full of stars, feeling the hollow in my chest churn with anger, confusion, and something close to despair. The stars stretched out above me, endless, indifferent, and the question burned in me, fierce and bright. Was I wrong? Had I followed a man who could offer me nothing but empty words? That night I decided I needed to find the courage to ask the healer myself, to make him see the weight of what he was asking from us. But when I approached him, he offered no justifications, no reassurances. My anger sharpened, rising until it was all I could think about. Can you imagine what it's like to watch every hope you've ever had slip away, to see it crumble like dust in the wind? That's how it felt, standing there in the street, watching them drag him forward. His hands bound, his face streaked with blood and grime. The man I'd followed, the one I'd believed would finally deliver us, now looked like nothing more than a broken wanderer, stumbling under the weight of a wooden cross. He didn't fight, didn't resist. He just took each step, quiet and resigned, as if he had accepted the path before him. And I felt like a fool. All those words about love, all those soft glances, those calls for peace, for what? To be beaten and humiliated, to let himself be led to slaughter? My heart pounded, and anger, hot and consuming, filled the hollow I'd once hoped he might heal. Was this what I'd followed? A man who spoke of forgiveness and then walked willingly into the hands of his enemies? Each step he took, blood trailing behind him, felt like a betrayal. This wasn't liberation. This was surrender. My hands shook as I pushed through the crowd, my breath coming fast, my chest tightening with a rage I could barely contain. Why? I thought, my mind racing. Why did I follow him? Why did I believe? I pushed closer, shoving past the jeering crowd. The noise around me, the cries of soldiers, the wails of the grieving, blurred into a dull roar. All I could see was him. He stumbled, falling to his knees under the weight of the cross, and in that moment something in me broke. I wanted him to feel my anger, to understand the depth of his betrayal. I wanted to look into his eyes and find some answer, some explanation. I pushed through the throng until I was standing just feet away from him. For a moment, I froze. He looked up, his face bruised and bloody, his eyes locking onto mine, and in those eyes I saw no fear, no shame, only sadness. That made the fire inside me burn hotter. My fists clenched, my breath shallow. "Is this it?" I hissed, my words laced with bitterness. "Is this how you save us? By letting them take you? By giving up?" He said nothing at first, just held my gaze with a quiet sorrow that felt heavier than words. I wanted him to fight back, to call down the heavens, to prove to me that I hadn't followed him for nothing. But instead he spoke. His voice soft but so clear it cut through the noise around us, each word settling into the space between us like a stone. "You will walk," he said, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't comprehend, "until the day the Son of Man returns." At first I didn't understand. I thought it was just another riddle, another gentle parable meant to pacify me. But as the crowd surged around him, pulling him forward, the meaning sank in, cold and hollow, seeping into my bones. I stood there, rooted to the spot, his words echoing in my mind, pressing into me like a curse. I wanted to call out, to demand an explanation, but my voice died in my throat. All I could see was his face, that quiet sadness, and all I could feel was the weight of those words, wrapping around me like a shroud. Days passed, then weeks, and I felt it. A strange heaviness, a pulling in my chest that grew with each step, as if the earth itself were binding me, chaining me to the ground. I tried to shake it off, to push his words from my mind, but they lingered, haunting me with a meaning I didn't want to face. At first I thought it was guilt. Guilt for doubting him, for mocking him in his final moments. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I realized the truth. I felt no hunger, no thirst, no fatigue. My steps never slowed, my body never weakened, and no matter where I went, the ache in my chest followed me, hollow and gnawing, reminding me of the words he'd spoken. I wandered from village to village, city to city, trying to escape the curse that hung over me. But each night, I heard his voice again, echoing in the silence, pressing down on me with a weight I couldn't shake. I watched people around me grow old, watched children become adults, watched the seasons shift, and yet I remained unchanged, my steps unending, my path stretching out before me like an open wound. I didn't fully understand it then. Not the depth of it, not the endlessness, but somewhere in the quiet, in the lonely stretches of road, I began to feel it. A weight I would carry forever, a wound that would never heal. Once, I found myself standing on the outskirts of a village. I watched as soldiers descended upon it, their banners bright against the gray sky. I wanted to warn the people, to shout for them to run, but my voice faltered, and when I finally found the words, no one turned. My cries passed through them like wind, unheard, unnoticed. I watched as the soldiers tore through the village, as the flames climbed higher, as the screams faded into silence. And all I could do was bear witness, helpless as the weight in my chest grew heavier. It was then that I began to understand. The curse wasn't just to walk, it was to witness, to carry the suffering I once ignored, to see the pain I thought I could solve with strength alone. Compassion, I realized too late, wasn't weakness. It was a strength I'd refused to see. And so I walked. Every step became a reminder, every mile a reflection of the choices I'd made. I carried the weight of my doubt, my anger, my bitterness, and with each step I felt the hollow inside me deepen, filling not with rage anymore, but with regret, a cold, unrelenting ache that would never fade. There are days when I wonder if he knew what I would become, if in that one look he saw everything that would follow, the lifetimes I would wander, the faces of countless strangers I would watch fade into memory. Sometimes I think he must have known. Perhaps this was the only way I could truly understand what he tried to teach me. I think about that day often, the way his eyes met mine as I hurled my anger at him, blind to the mercy he offered. I see it as clearly as if it happened yesterday, the sadness in his gaze, quiet disappointment. Now I understand that my curse wasn't just punishment. It was a reflection of the emptiness I carried within me, an emptiness I chose over compassion, over love. That emptiness is my only companion now. I am drawn to places where the earth groans under the weight of sorrow, wars that leave fields soaked in blood, fires that turn entire cities to ash, storms that swallow villages whole. I cannot turn away. It's not a choice. It's the curse pulling me, forcing me to witness what I once refused to see. Each time I try, each time I fail, and each time I hear his voice again. You will walk until the day the Son of Man returns. I thought justice meant power. I thought freedom required violence. But now I see the truth. Compassion is not weakness, and kindness is not surrender. They are the hardest truths, the strongest acts. They take more courage than I ever had. These truths are my burden now. I see them in every tear, in every cry that fades to silence. I see them in the ashes left behind, in the lives broken by pride and cruelty. These are the lessons I refused to learn, and now they follow me, step after step, mile after mile. If you ever see a stranger on the road, a man with weary eyes and an endless tread, maybe you'll know. Maybe you'll see the weight I carry, the curse that binds me to this world. unable to rest, unable to die. And maybe if you look closely, you'll see the faint glimmer of hope I cling to in the quiet moments, the hope that one day he will return, that I will be forgiven, that I will finally find the rest I've been denied. Until then, I walk,